Greetings as we come to look at the second part of Mark chapter 6, that is verses 14 to 29. Terrible story of John the Baptizer, or John the Baptist, being put to death simply for reasons of human sin, lust, arrogance, greed, revenge, the worst of humanity, putting to death the one who Jesus calls the greatest of the prophets. Horrible story, but it's here because it's true, because it's part of the story, and because it has a very important place in the story, not least in the way Mark puts it here, sandwiched between Jesus sending out his first disciples on their first mission training event and them coming back and reporting on it. So it's in that context that this story appears, though of course it has great significance for Jesus' own story. In fact, in Mark's Gospel, there are only two sections in which Jesus isn't the subject. And one is in chapter 1 and one is here. Both cases, it's John the Baptist who's the focus of the story. Elsewhere, right through Mark, all the many little and big stories put together into the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is always the focus of attention, except a little bit of chapter 1 and a bigger bit here in chapter 6, where it's John the Baptist. He's an important part of the story. And Jesus talks about him as the forerunner and as the one who is leading people towards faith in Jesus. And Jesus presents him as the greatest of the Old Testament prophets. Well, Jesus is performing miracles and he's becoming well known, and he's sending his disciples out on missionary journeys and so on. And King Herod gets to hear of it. Verse 14, Mark 6, verse 14. King Herod heard of it. Now, it would be very easy to be confused by Herod because there are 4 different Herods in the New Testament. It's not that difficult, although the family tree of the Herods, someone has described as gnarled and twisted as an ancient olive tree. And if you've seen ancient olive trees where branches twist round and trunks twist round and so on, mighty complicated, to describe Herod's family tree as like that is not a bad one. The best known historically of the Herods is called Herod the Great. Now, he was a great builder. He was involved in rebuilding the temple, the great Temple Mount in Jerusalem. He built many fortresses and palaces for himself and his family. He was the ruler under Roman authority, but he was powerful and he was allowed a great deal of power. He bent the knee to Rome as necessary, but otherwise he controlled the whole area, which could variously be described as Palestine, Judea, modern day thinking it would involve much of Lebanon, particularly southern Lebanon, Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, parts of Western Syria and the current Kingdom of Jordan. Huge area, both sides of the River Jordan, much of the Mediterranean coast, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, and all the land inland as far as the River Jordan, and then further still. That was the territory of Herod the Great. He had 4 sons, and when he died, it was split between them, and they were called tetrarchs, which means ruler of a quarter. or 4 rulers, but each had a quarter of Herod's former kingdom. And this particular Herod in verse 14 is Herod Antipas. And he became the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. Galilee is the northern quarter or third or so of Israel, and Perea just across the Jordan, a little bit further south. We would think of it today as southern southwest Syria and the western northwest corner of the kingdom of Jordan. So he's tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, which may seem two different bits to us today, and they are, of course. They're separated by the River Jordan, and Galilee is a bit to the north of Perea. But that was the quarter of Herod the Great's kingdom that Herod Antipas inherited. He wasn't technically a king. Rome gave some of its vassal states and rulers the title of king if it deemed them important enough and if they were well behaved. Herod Antipas was never given the title of king, though sometimes he claimed it. And he didn't rule over the whole kingdom. So when Jesus is on trial, to work out which of the different tetrarchs he comes under as a Jewish authority. It was all under Pontius Pilate as a Roman province, but because Jesus came from the Galilee region, he came under Herod Antipas. And this Herod Antipas wasn't the strong, cruel monster that his father was. Father, great builder, great achiever, and utterly ruthless. It was his father, Herod the Great, who'd had the innocent babies of Bethlehem slaughtered when he'd heard there was a rival king. But Herod the Great, famous in history for his architectural building and for a lot of things he did, but also notorious as utterly ruthless. His son, Herod Antipas, one of his sons, Herod Antipas, also ruthless, as we see here, but much less competent, a less able ruler. He had 2 cities built, one called Tiberias on the western shore of Galilee, where he sort of made a headquarters, and that's still there. But he built it, and it was really more of a Roman than a Jewish city, and still is. It's Jewish, but it isn't ancient Jewish in the way that the villages and other towns around Galilee are. And he built another capital city north of Nazareth, which eventually fell to nothing and is now just archaeological ruins. But he was known as weak. He was also known as degenerate in various ways. Now, Herod the Great, his father, wasn't any example of upright moral purity. He managed to go through 10 wives and have children by many of them. But no one doubted his strength or his power. Herod Antipas was known as weak, and although he liked to claim kingship, he never received the official title of king. And here we see him manipulated by Herodias, his wife. Well, Herodias, let's put wife in quotes. Herodias was the wife of his brother, half-brother Philip, and Herod decided he wanted her as his wife, and he ditched his previous wife and took Herodias. And John the Baptist, in his preaching, condemned Herod for that. Jesus, in his preaching, describes Herod Antipas on one occasion as that fox. He wasn't held in very high respect by anyone. A self-important but weak son of a powerful father. Very difficult, painful story, and known for his immorality, and particularly for pinching his brother's wife. That ultimately would cause his downfall, because his first wife, who he ditched in favor of Herodias, was the daughter of the king of Nabatea. Nabatea is what we would call today southern Jordan, across the River Jordan. If you cross the Jordan at the Dead Sea, then the land of Jordan beyond the Dead Sea used to be the kingdom of Nabatea. And Herod's first wife's father was king of Nabatea. After he chucks her out, she goes back to father, and a certain enmity arises between the king of Nabatea and Herod Antipas. And not very long after this, about 3 or 4 years after this, the king of Nabatea has a little go at Herod, and there's a small war which Herod loses in disgrace. And ultimately only the Roman Empire sort of rescues him and keeps him in charge notionally of Galilee and Perea. But 3 years later, the Roman Empire becomes utterly fed up of him, and they exile him and Herodias to Gaul to live out the rest of their short lives in what we would call France. But his power is taken from him. And his ditching of his first wife for Herodias is part of his downfall, and another part of his downfall is what goes on here. Herod had John arrested and put in prison because John had criticized his marriage to Herodias. Herod is cross about that and doesn't like people criticizing him publicly. I think Herodias is more than cross, and Herodias has a real sense of vengeance against John and wants rid of him. One of the commentators on Mark's Gospel, a well-known man of 50 years ago or so, in his commentary, he wrote that the only place Herodias wanted her marriage certificate written was on the back of John the Baptist's death warrant. That's quite a nice little picture of a woman who was plotting vengeance against the man who criticized her marriage to the king, the tetrarch Herod Antipas. And Herodias, we told in verse 19, had a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But Herod didn't want to kill him, Herod in his strange weakness. And here's an example of human weakness in understanding of Jesus that is ever so common. From an important chap who'd read and who knew his stuff. He knew world politics, and he read books, and he had opinions and views. It's just his personality was seriously defective. But we're told, verse 20, Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, yet he liked to listen to him. What a picture of that is that. He has John put in prison because John's criticized his second marriage and his divorce. John has to stay in prison because Herod's new wife hates John so much. But Herod likes listening to John's preaching. He's intrigued by him. He's perplexed. He doesn't understand it all, but he realizes that he's a prophet. He knows he's a holy and righteous man, and he protects him. So doubtless he isn't rotting in the worst dungeon. He's locked up, but he's okay. And Herod likes to hear him preach. I can just imagine him being brought out of prison from time to time to preach in front of Herod, because just tell me what this means. Tell me about that. What's happening here? Give me some prophetic wisdom, please. Speak to me from God. And then John will partly talk about the wickedness of his ditching his first wife and taking up another one. But even though Herod doesn't like the message, he rather likes to hear it. It's very like people today saying Jesus was the greatest teacher who ever lived, but not following him. Or Jesus was a great preacher, but not believing what he says. Or other religions sometimes saying we honor Jesus as a great prophet and preacher. Well, I'd want to challenge them and say, Jesus says he is the way, the truth, and the life. Do you accept that Jesus is the way to God? Do you accept Jesus as risen from the dead and still alive? You need to push, because proximity to Jesus doesn't mean you believe in him. We saw that in the last section with his own family. We see it with Judas Iscariot. We see it, John, of course, John in the opening chapter of his gospel tells us his own people did not receive him. His family didn't believe in him. His hometown didn't believe in him. Not all his apostles believed in him. It took them time, and one never did. Proximity to Jesus doesn't guarantee belief in him. And loving to hear the preaching of John the Baptist, who's always pointing to Jesus, doesn't guarantee you're going to believe it. Isn't the human heart twisted and corrupt and weird and horrible at times? As the Bible tells us it is. And here's Herod, who is a man with a fair degree of power, who is ruling only a quarter of his father's kingdom, but it's still a fair chunk. Here's a man who can build a new city. He's got power like that. Here's a man who has command over troops. Here's a man with a real degree of power and who likes to make something of himself. He has this party for his birthday. We're told, verse 21, Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for courtiers and officers and the leaders of Galilee. All the important people or self-important people are invited to Herod's birthday party. Birthday party was a big thing in Rome. You celebrated the emperor's birthday. It was a public holiday. Herod is sort of trying to make himself out like the emperor. Great banquet for his birthday. Celebrating birthdays like this wasn't part of Jewish culture, but it was part of Roman imperial culture. So Herod is already more than compromised with Rome. He's acting like a Roman governor in having a big party for his birthday and not following the Jewish customs, which he should be following. His ancestry is a bit weird and wacky. Effectively it's half Jewish, but he proclaims himself the ruler of part of the Jewish land. But he is less Jewish and more Roman in his behavior, sadly. But he gives this big party and invites all the important people. And then his daughter Herodias came in and danced. She pleased Herod and his guests, and the king said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you wish, and I'll give it you." He solemnly swore, "Whatever you ask me, I'll give you even half my kingdom." Now, there's any amount of stuff going on here that shouldn't be going on. Not least, he can't give away half his kingdom because it isn't a kingdom, and he is a tetrarch, which is a pretty low form of life among vassal rulers in the Roman Empire. Who followed Herod was up to Rome, not him. And the territory wasn't his to give away. It belonged to Rome, and he was simply the steward of it for as long as they wanted him. They could depose him, and they did later on. It isn't his to give away at all. But what's Herodias doing dancing clearly at his invitation, though she would seem to be happy to do this. She's part of the whole corrupt network, I suspect. There's a little bit of background and a number of parallels in the Old Testament book of Esther, where the king has a banquet and asks his queen Vashti wants to present her to the banquet. Now, a banquet in those days, back in the time of Esther, in the Persian Empire, and in the Israelite world and the Roman world, a banquet was for men or for women, and it was often in parallel. And we may or may not like that as a custom and culture, but that's how it was. And there may well be a parallel banquet, and you read Esther and you can find that sort of thing happens, that if Herod had a banquet for the important men, his wife on the same day or another day the same week would have a banquet for the important women, for their wives. They might all even turn up to a big palace together, but the men would go to one banqueting hall and the women to another. That's how it was done. And they weren't brought together. Maybe it was male humor in one and female in another, or male singing and stories or whatever in one and women in another. It wasn't brought together. It was a separation of the sexes in the way they did things for a great banquet. The king in chapter 1 of Esther is very conscious of the utter beauty of his wife Vashti, and he wants to show her off to the men at the banquet. So he summons Vashti to come in to his banquet and show off her beauty to the men, whatever that may mean. And she refuses. And that's her downfall. And the story of Esther begins with Queen Vashti's refusal to come to the male banquet and show off her beauty. It wasn't done. And certainly a high-up member of the royal family wouldn't do that. They might have slave girls dancing or dancing girls at the men's banquet, but that was not something that was thought of as honorable in any way. You know what I'm saying. But here's Herodias, Herod's daughter, demeaning herself by dancing at the men's banquet. We're not told what sort of dance. We don't need to be, but it rather impresses Herod and others. He may well be more drunk than sober. We don't know. We don't know what's going on. But Herodias should not have been dancing at Herod's banquet, and Herod should not have asked her to or summoned her to. She is up for causing some trouble, up for what she can get out of it, it would appear. And then she rushes off when he says, "What do you want? What huge gift can I give you? I like your dancing. I like what you've shown us of yourself. Let me reward you." And she asks her mother, who is waiting for this, or she asks Herodias, the head of John the Baptist, John the Baptizer. That's what she's always wanted. So she goes in and makes it a bit dramatic. I want you, in fact, the way in the original, it's slightly different from our translation. I want you to give me at once on a platter the head of John the Baptizer. Our translations put John a bit earlier on in the sentence, which is a shame because it's dramatic effect. I want you to give me at once on a platter. We're at a banquet. There'll be platters of food all over. I want you to give me at once on a platter the head of John the Baptizer. Very dramatically said. King is deeply grieved, 26. Out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he didn't want to refuse her. Sent a soldier of the guard to bring John's head, and that is done. And then the girl gave it to her mother. When the disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. It's a dreadful story, isn't it? utterly horrifying. It's a story we know quite well, but it's a story that's talking about a weak king who acknowledges John the Baptist as a great preacher, who acknowledges him as a prophet from God, who loves to hear him preach, but will not accept his message. What does that say about people hearing the Christian message today? People discussing Christianity, people, and I've come across this in the House of Lords. Important people saying to me when I was a member there, "It's so good to have you bishops here, some of you, because you can teach us a bit of morality and you can keep us on the straight and narrow." But as soon as bishops started to say anything really clear, our understanding of Christian principles or how society could listen to God's teaching or Jesus' teaching, we'd be told to keep out of politics. In other words, we like your presence. We like you to preach and say prayers. And in the House of Lords in England, the bishop says prayers at the beginning of every day, and people turn up and listen. And then they say, keep out of politics. So it's rather like, my wife, this is politics. This is not your business, John. I love to hear you preaching, and tell me about God, and tell me God's plan for the world today, and hopefully tell me I'm important. But no politics, please. It's wanting to hear preaching and not wanting to obey it, not wanting to obey the God from whom it comes. Deeply distressing. And you've got the vengeance of Herodias, of the queen, and the wickedness of Herodias acting in that way for her mother. What a world we live in. The disciples, John the Baptist's disciples, heard and came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. What a brave thing to do. In contrast, perhaps, to Jesus' disciples who just ran away. And Jesus' body was laid in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea, one of the leaders of the Jewish people who perhaps had come to a secret faith, but his own disciples didn't give him that honor. John's did. Just a little contrast to note, sadly. But see this horrible story also as part of a sandwich, as the middle of a sandwich, because in verses 7 to 12, we've seen Jesus sending his disciples out on a training mission for apostles. In verse 30, which is another time, we're going to see the apostles gathering round Jesus. They come back and tell him all they've done and taught. And so they report back on the mission of preaching and teaching and healing and casting out evil spirits and so on, that their mission of Jesus' message to the world. They're sent out, they come back, and in the middle, the sandwich, the meat in the sandwich, is the fierce, vicious opposition of those who preach the message. The disciples haven't encountered much of it. They've shaken the dust off their feet from places where they haven't been believed. They've encountered unbelief, but they haven't encountered fierce opposition. But Mark is giving us the true picture. Jesus' message, when it's proclaimed, and Jesus' followers, when they proclaim it, will find some belief and some unbelief. But they will also find fierce, wicked opposition. And they need to be ready for it. And this story is put in this place by Mark, saying if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, you'll find some will believe and some won't believe. Even those who love to hear the message, some will believe. Don't be conned because people like the message or like the preaching or turn up to church to hear a preacher. Don't be conned by any of that. Doesn't mean they're following, obeying, receiving the message, receiving Jesus. And among those who enjoy hearing the message will be some whose opposition is vicious. And we have a hint of that from Judas Iscariot earlier on. And here we have more than a hint of it about the wretched Herod Antipas and his wicked wife and her wicked daughter. And John's disciples bury his body in a tomb and give him the honor in death, which Jesus received himself, but not from his own disciples. Mark introduces this story here for us to tell us what sort of opposition Jesus is heading towards, and to tell us what committed Christianity and committed Christians may well face in the centuries to come, being faithful to him, preaching his message, but necessarily being aware that there can be unbelief, and there will be, and there can be opposition, and there will be. Come to Jesus, follow him, believe and obey. But it won't all be roses, won't all be sweetness and light, because Jesus' message will be loved and will be hated. Bless you. Amen.